Welcome to Teach My Brain. This is our video of 5 photos you wish you'd never seen, but now you have. So today, we're going to tell the story of 5 infamous photographs that plumb the depths of our collective fear and despair and show the world as its most harsh and brutal. And our first image certainly shows this. In July 1975, Stanley Foreman was ready to make his way home from the offices of the Boston Herald when news came in of a major fire in a nearby row of old Victorian houses. Rushing to the scene with his motorised camera, Foreman arrived to find the blaze well underway and several fire crews already organising what he expected to be a fairly routine rescue of a woman and child trapped on the external fire escape. As Foreman watched from below, firefighter Bob O'Neill lowered himself down off his ladder and asked 19-year-old Diana Bryant to pass a goddaughter tiara to him. Unfortunately, the heat from the horrific blaze had already forced Diana further and further along the metal railings, out of his grasp. So as she stretched her arms to try and pass the little baby girl across, the fire escape buckled and collapsed beneath her. Diana and Tiara fell 15 metres to the ground below, where Diana landed head first, suffering multiple injuries that would kill her a few days later. Baby Tiara landed on top of Diana and survived, her godmother's broken body cushioning her landing. The fire had been started deliberately, if accidentally, by the owner of the building, who had been repeatedly burning rubbish in the street behind the building over the previous weeks. He had also failed to either check or maintain the building's fire escapes, and no one from the city had checked upon him either. When he was eventually charged, it was with running an unlicensed boarding house, and not with the manslaughter of Diana Bryant. Boston City Council was forced to act after the Herald printed the photo the next day, and within 48 hours, new safety protocols for fire escapes were implemented citywide. Moreover, after the photo was reprinted nationally, landlords all over the USA were forced to take action to mend and properly maintain dangerous fire escapes, ushering in a safer future. But that was of little comfort to the family of Diana and Tiara, and therein lies our fear. Wonderful lives can be taken in an instant, even when would-be rescuers fight to save us. As the Grenfell Tower disaster showed in London in 2017, this type of tragedy is still blighting our cities today. Our homes are supposed to be safe, the places we can sleep safely in, with the harsh world kept quarantined outside. But sometimes that cruel outside world finds a way into our homes and destroys all we love without us knowing or expecting it. This is what happened to Bhopal in December 1984. Union Carbide had been manufacturing pesticides from methyl isocyanate in the city since 1969. And to say they'd been careless in that time is quite clearly an understatement. With the plant rusting away and vital safety procedures either ignored or deliberately closed off, huge quantities of potentially lethal gases and chemicals were stored on site, waiting in vain for an upturn in the global pesticide market. Just after 10:30 p.m, pressures within tank 610 started surpassing safety limits, and while technicians were concerned as this tank was known to be clogged with waste, they ignored the data, thinking that it was probably just another faulty sensor. By 11:30, workers in this area were starting to show the signs of chemical poisoning, and managers ordered staff to search for a leak. When this leak was found 15 minutes later, however, the managers did nothing and instead went off for their scheduled tea break. By the time the break was over, the unchecked leak had left tank 610 in a critical state, and with the chemicals within it boiling away, it was now impossible to stop. At 12:40 p.m, 40 tons of deadly gas was vented into the atmosphere. The wind was blowing straight towards the heavily populated slums southeast of the factory. Even now, though, lives could have been saved, as the plant had warning sirens fitted that could have alerted the sleeping people of Bhopal to the impending disaster. Instead, though, the decision was made to only sound the internal plant sirens, allowing workers time to escape upwind. The slum dwellers downwind were not so lucky. The first most people knew of the gas cloud was the screams of their neighbours as their lungs and eyes burned. Thousands fled straight into the cloud, with children and the elderly most at risk as the gas was stronger low to the ground. Perhaps as many as 16,000 people died, Union Carbide took 5 years to pay any damages and still claim to this day that it was sabotage and not their incompetence. The next day, Pablo Bartholomew photographed this young girl being buried in the poison ground where she'd lived. No name was recorded. Murder is the most heinous and cruel act that can be perpetrated. All 5 of our images today show life being taken away in one way or another, but our third unforgettable photograph is the only one that actually shows the act of a life being taken for the personal gratification of another. Regina K. Walters was a 14-year-old girl from a broken home in Pasadena, Texas, who met 18-year-old Ricky Lee Jones in late 1989. The pair both hated their mundane, dysfunctional lives and wanted out of this humid stretch of coast, so they made a pact to run away together, planning to hitchhike to Mexico. Sadly, neither Regina or Ricky made it. Stopping at a truck stop to find a ride with a long-distance trucker, the pair ran into Robert Rhodes, who was only too eager to offer his help. To the outside world, Rhodes was a calm and composed, smooth-talking ex-Marine authority figure. Inside his travelling torture chamber, though, he was a degenerate sadist and serial killer of vulnerable young people. Neither Regina or Ricky stood a chance. Ricky was almost certainly quickly shot dead and dumped in Mississippi at some later point. Regina, though, was held captive and repeatedly raped and tortured by her captor for several weeks that winter across 4 American states, until they reached this lonely, abandoned barn. Here Regina was forced to put on a dark dress and shoes and pose for her oppressor before he eventually strangled her to death with a roll of barbed wire. That in itself is sickening and shocking, but what made this worse is that the murderer photographed Regina begging for mercy while he taunted and tormented her in the barn. The FBI eventually found these photos and used them to convict Rhodes, but not before this little girl had had to endure countless agonies. All of the images we are looking at today show death in one form or another, and while our first and second both show the shock or surprise of unexpected, negligent death, what is particularly horrific about this, the last known photograph of Regina Walters, is the fear of foreknowledge. Scum like Rhodes gain pleasure from instilling panic and dread in their victims, and in Regina's desperate attempt to keep her debased attacker away, we see only too well that she surely knew what was coming. And after what she'd been forced to endure over the previous weeks, it is to her enduring credit that she was still trying to fight back and fend off the abhorrent creature that had taken her. So far, we've looked at how the actions of neglectful, incompetent or cruel humans have caused devastation and needless death, and as a species, we truly have questions to answer about our predilection for causing unnecessary pain and suffering. But what happens when it's not the actions of humans alone that causes this suffering? What happens when nature plays its own unrelenting part? Kevin Carter was a world-renowned South African photojournalist who documented the brutality of the anti-apartheid struggle throughout the 1980s. But he only became world famous after chancing upon this infamous scene in South Sudan in 1993. Much of East Africa is an arid place, cooked mercilessly under the harsh tropical sun. Receiving barely enough rainfall in a normal year to stave off desertification, during the prolonged droughts that this region suffers, there is simply not enough water to quench the parched crops and make them grow. And so, vegetation dies, then biodiversity dies, and eventually life itself dies. And this was happening as Kevin Carter arrived in March 1993. Photojournalists are driven by the search for that one shot, so audacious or so eye-catching that it will transcend its source story and become representative of what it sets out to report. Here is the ultimate example of that. As Carter stood and watched desperate villagers receiving food aid from the United Nations, he saw a small emaciated child struggling to walk to the aid station. As he raised his camera to shoot, he saw a well-fed vulture sitting in the dirt, watching the child too. Its intense gaze was not to record a humanitarian disaster, however. It was spying food. Carter did not let the child die. He shooed the bird away and watched as the little boy slowly stood up and ambled to the relative safety of the aid station. But that was not to say that this bird was not here for a reason. More than 10 adults a day were dying of starvation, and with bodies not always found or buried quickly, Opportunities for a scavenger were never far away. While the child would survive this encounter, Kevin Carter's soul did not. Haunted by the plight of this little boy and the horrors he'd seen across the continent, he took his own life a year later. His suicide note read in part, "I am haunted by the vivid memories of killings and corpses and anger and pain." This record of one such memory outlives him. Our final image shows a face that has haunted the world for over 30 years. In November 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia exploded, unleashing superheated torrents of volcanic mud down the mountainside. In its path lay the heavily populated farming town of Amero. Colombia, in 1985, was in the midst of a never-ending drugs war, with bands of armed gangsters, left-wing rebels and right-wing death squads fighting for territory against the US-backed government. Days before the eruption, Marxist rebels had stormed the Supreme Court in Bogotá, and a botched rescue attempt had left half its judges dead. Within this backdrop, it was easy, but inexcusable, to see why no one took action to protect the city of Amero from impending disaster. Nevado del Ruiz was a sleeping giant dormant for 140 years, but still very much an active volcano. Smoke, gases and chemicals regularly poured from its crater, and volcanologists had long warned that it was primed for explosion. Yet no one listened to the mayor when he asked for help, and when the Red Cross radioed through to try and facilitate an evacuation, poor planning and a lack of resources meant that it never happened. While all this was going on, 13-year-old Amira Sanchez and her family lay awake listening to the volcano rumble away in the distance, unaware that a 30-metre high lahar was about to smash their house to pieces. When the roof collapsed on top of her, and thousands of litres of water rushed in to envelope her home, Amira was trapped. She was to stay this way for 3 agonising days. Amira was left up to her neck in a putrid mess of sewage, volcanic acids and chemicals, and through it all her strength and dignity was evident. Instead of screaming in pain or desperation, she calmly gave interviews and worried about missing a maths test. She'd been pinned down by her legs to the collapsed roof of the house, with a dead aunt's body pulling her further down like a vice. While rescuers had managed to keep her head above the poison, they had no way to get to her, as they had no pump to get the water out. The army had sent soldiers with rifles and machine guns instead. By the time the Red Cross could get enough water out to attempt the double amputation Amira needed to survive, she was already close to death. Amira would have had to endure both her legs being removed while awake. She had to be allowed to die. But before she did, this brave little girl even suggested that her rescuers should take a break, because surely they must be tired by now. Her final words were to tell her mum that she loved her.